This is Duke University.
Each speaker will have 30 to 35 minutes to deliver their papers, and then we'll have questions at the end, gathering them up in a nice, neat bundle. First speaker will be Sergei Dolgopolsky, who teaches in the Department of Comparative Literature at State University of New York in Buffalo, where he's also affiliated with its Institute for Jewish Thought and Heritage. PhD from UC Berkeley and General Theological Union, and another doctorate in philosophical sciences from the Russian Academy of Sciences. So without further ado, Professor Dolgopolsky.
Well, let me catch the penultimate opportunity and to thank the conveners, Shai and Jonathan, and the organizer, Dennis, and everybody else in the audience for putting this gathering together. And even if my project is sloth, without any further delay, I indulge on the paper. How the Talmudic, first of all, is acoustics working well? Am I heard? Yes. Okay. How the Talmudic operation of refutation complicates modern theoretical foundations of the political form, including and based on their ramifications in the again modern figures or types of the human being and the Jew. Here I borrow in advance Lakula Barth's notion of the type from his work on typography, which borrowing I will immediately justify, as I will also do the notion of the political form, which I am again borrowing from Carl Schmitt's work. Let me begin with, it's almost already tradition here, begin with their anecdote or a joke. It is 1970s, Moscow, Red Square. Rabinovich, a typical Jewish surname, stands there distributing political leaflets. A KGB agent sees that. Wishing to arrest Rabinovich, the agent grabs one of the leaflets, but only to discover that there is nothing written on them. They are just plain sheets of paper. The agent asks Rabinovich, "Why you don't have anything written on them?" Here comes the punchline, which I will do my best translating. But has it all not been clear regardless? The anecdote gives the context and provides me a topos to think through, a notion that both will animate the analysis in this essay and afford a language enabling to formulate its task. So let me begin by building some kind of theoretical apparatus, or if you wish, toys, which I'll be using analyzing the work of the act or the work of Rabinovich. The first notion comes from Schmitt's earlier work, Roman Catholicism and Political Form, where he playfully and marginally describes the political form as representation of representation. In a sense that Rabinovich here represents something without representing anything in particular. So I'll be using representation of the first order as this fundamental representation that comes even before anything particular is represented, and representation of the second order referring to a particular thing, a represented reality. Beyond the leaflets, beyond the Rabinovich empty leaflets, there is another perhaps more known example of representation, and in particular of the power of such representation. This is the ex cathedra principle. of the principle of infallibility of everything and anything the Pope says from the podium in St. Peter, Rome. However, unlike the Pope, whose words are still means matching ends, Rabinovich acts seems to be irrational from the techno-economical standpoint of the KGB agent. As a type of techno-economical rationality, the agent from the story, if he would be taken to Rome, might still be able to understand the Pope as a political type, as a representation of the representation, because the Pope on the podium does not keep silence. Rabinovich, however, makes even the silence into what, according to Roman Catholicism and political forum, would still be such a forum. I, however, am not completely sure that Schmidt would endorse such a silent polity. And I will be working more to introduce the notion of the refutation as underlining the possibility of thinking of refutation, which is the foundational Talmudic operation of thinking, in my view, as what also may be considered as a political forum. Let me now move to second theoretical concept that I will be using in this analysis. This concept is the fictioning essence of reason. It's a term in Lakula Bar essay on typography. There are two, working through a Heideggerian notion of Gestell, Labar, to restate it really quickly, introduces two forms of Gestell, which will lead to the notion of the type. One is the classical Platonic form, which I will designate that way for the purposes of the argument, in which fiction is necessary in order for us to be able to get access to the idea through look, which is precisely the definition of theory. So theory is based and grounded on the necessity of creation of the visual or any other perceptive fictions, with only the requirement that those fictions, of course, must be the right one, as opposed to the wrong one, which would be mimetic. The second, more interesting and more complicated version of the Gestell is, according to Lacour-Labat, type. Or, to borrow another term, I would be able to say spectre. The difference between the idea and type is that within the idea as the form of Gestalt, the fictioning essence of reason works in such a way that we could still pretty comfortably eliminate mistakes, and if there is something unclear, then any kind of being unclear is only a result of a mistaken understanding. This is not the case with the type. The fictioning essence of reason reaches to the point when the confusion, rather than the mistake, cannot be eliminated. And that's why we're talking about the spectre, something that haunts you, cannot be cut, and cannot be completely fixed. The examples of such a spectre, more known examples of such, or more obvious examples of such a spectre, is Marx's notion of labor, Marx's notion, of course, of communism, obviously, but also Marx's very complicated idea of fetishism of commodity. Less known, but perhaps more productive examples of this form of the Gestalt or this form of the type could be the notions of the Jew and the human being that I would like to take up for analysis. One such approximation of the notion of Gestalt via type is the Mensch, man, or, if purportedly disgendered, human being. The logic of the function of that Gestalt has to do with bridging the differences between terms through making one of them be the bridge. For example, the difference between man and woman have been bridged in the past by creating a fiction of both of them being a man in general. In this logic of fictioning, any of these terms could be used for bridging. With man no longer politically correct, woman becomes a possibility. Yet the switch from man to woman as a universal only repeats the inevitability of having a spectre or of using one of them one of the terms of the difference to bridge that difference. With this in mind, I approach a specter which I will technically call a human as a Jew, even if I could potentially call it as a Jew as a human. The modern industrial specter of a human is much more closely connected to that of the Jew than it might seem. The spectral nature of these two figures becomes more clearly discernible if juxtaposed to other contexts in which the Jew functions as an image and or a concept, but not as a specter. That is to say, as an idea. In classical Christian theology, Jew is a complicated thing which could not be placed either among the pagans, neither among the pagans nor among heretics. But let me go from late ancient idea of the Jew to modern spectral nature of it as lurks or transpires from a juxtaposition between Hannah Arendt and Pavel Florensky, a Russian Eastern Orthodox theologian. Hannah Arendt remarks insightfully that within the context of humanity, she does not want to be treated as a human, but rather she wants to be treated as a Jew. The point in her pariah work is that it were Jews who were responsible for and inspired by and pushing for the idea that all of us are humans. Nobody else really cared. So she wanted to reclaim her Jewishness within the context of humanity, refusing to be treated as a human being. In contrast, a thinker who completely disconnected from Hannah Arendt by any means or standards, except that working at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, Russia, which is not much of a consolation, says that a notion of the human being is a Jewish invention. Jews, in this case, well, looking into his notion of человек, which is basically means a guy, the least common denominator in the Russian language that basically means a slave as well. So Florensky accuses Jews for having invented what perhaps in the American context would be best translated as the Barbie doll, an ideal that everybody strives to but nobody can achieve, thereby affording for the Jews to be in a good company of those who can't. So this common denominator, this universal notion of the human being, also criticized in Heidegger famously for being an ontic notion, is, according to both Florensky and according to Hannah Arendt, according to different logics of their analysis, is connected to the notion of the Jew. So the movement from the Jew to the human being and from the human being to the Jew is what transpires from those two different logic, rendering these two notions really strongly connected, even if this connection is not open for any kind of transparent logic, therefore making it into a type rather than into an idea. With this in mind, I now want to turn to the main purpose of this enterprise, to begin to think about the political form of the Talmud, beginning, of course, with Schmittian notion of representation. At the same time, attempting, after having retrieved this notion, to complicate Rabinovich's story and perhaps to offer reading him as not necessarily either a human or a Jew, but rather something else, which may transpire from the analysis of the political form in the Talmud. Not running too fast ahead of myself, I will basically be suggesting that the form of the refutation, and in particular refutation of refutation, will be my attempt to approximate the political form of the Talmud as opposed to Schmidt's representation of representation. To make some points in bringing this forth. First of all, if approached in these terms, the art of rhetoric, because refutation obviously belongs to this art, displayed on the pages of the Babylonian Talmud, redistributes the categories of refutation, invention, memory, delivery, and example famously found in the classical quintillian version of rhetoric. In the Talmud, refutation serves as the vehicle for memory for things. That's another technical term from his theory of rhetoric. And also as the vehicle for memory for words, an attempted and often ultimately failed refutation of the memory of the words of or about early authorities, which attempt results in a better, that is more precise, memory of the things involved in the teaching of these authorities. As a second point in this reconfiguration, the Talmudic modus operandi uses the vehicle of remembering, the process of refutation, and refutation is the vehicle of remembering, making this process of invention, the things, the enthymemes, to be remembered in the teachings or deeds of the early authorities, are getting discovered and by the same token invented through heuristic refuting of their verbal accounts. The third point of this redistribution is that refutation by the same token serves as the driving force of invention and as the truth criterion to judge the accuracy of the results. My understanding, or rather my memory of the accounts of the previous authorities are correct or true if I can come up with a viable possibility of looking at them as refutations of something else. So that by refuting the memory of the authoritative texts, I at the same time discover what this text refute. Along with this redistribution of the classical rhetorical tools, now to use refutation as a vehicle of remembering, there is a second element of Talmudic rhetoric, which I think also contributes to the political form. What does it exactly mean that memory embraces and exceeds thinking, producing the authority? The problem is that if we approach the memory of the Mishnah in the way described, then we come across the multiple version of what is the correct memory of it might be. In the context of the present essay, the question would then be how the prominence of refutation, and in particular of refutation in the Talmudic art of remembering, informs understanding the political form of the Talmud. And how understanding that form, if the Talmud indeed displays a political form, translates into understanding the connection between the Jew and human being in modernity. If we think it along the lines of Lakulaba terms of Gestalt and a modern version of it, of Gestell, then that takes me to the third point. Reconfiguring of the refutation in the Talmud subsumes other parts of rhetoric, meaning going beyond the traditional positions allowed for rhetorical schools within the either Aristotelian or Platonic traditions of philosophy. Instead, we use rhetoric outside or beyond the confines of philosophical discipline. To apply Schmidt's definition of the political form as a pure representation of representation would mean that the authority, including the political authority in the Talmud, would mean something different than what it means in Schmidt's reconstruction of the political. Representation of representation can of course mean that there is no secondary representation at all. However, unlike to what Pope might have do, that would also may mean representing nothing. If Pope would, by any kind of imagination, according to Schmidt, represents representation, then the Pope's silence ex cathedra would still be as infallible as any words. In other words, the political form of primary representation would work even with a 0 degree of secondary representation. Yet Rabinovich does even more. However, doubtfully that would be the case with the Pope silence at cathedra. The empty, and in that limited sense, silent leaflets do more than Pope's hypothetical silence would do. They refute. They refute not only and not primarily the words and the techno-economical world of the KGB agent, but also, and much more importantly, the leaflets undermine the very possibility of the 0 degree of secondary representation. As Rabinovich has it, they make their point without words. They refute the possibility of representational silence in the first place. What that means, rendering silence instead as not a representation, but rather as an act of refutation. What that means, however, is that representation gets circumscribed by a more fundamental operation, that of refuting, so that even silence, a 0 degree of representation, is still a positive degree of refutation. Next point in this outline of the political form of the Talmud that has implications for understanding both the Gestell and the Gestalt, including the interconnected modern gestalts of human being and Jew. As Lacoue-Labarre argues, Heidegger's reading tacitly excludes mimesis or Darstellung from representation. And obviously, following the Talmudic tradition, saying that, Platonic tradition, saying that the fictions of reason still need to be right fictions, and the wrong fictions are the mimetic ones, which need to be excluded. Lacoue-Labarre then suggests that the modern notion of the type still continues this tradition by creating specters, but the right ones, even if there is, he admits, the irrationality embedded in specters. Still, this irrationality is the right one, that which could be explained but cannot go away, as opposed to mimesis, which is a completely irrational fictionality. So then this figure of exclusion, the exclusion of irrational Darstellung, and not irrational mimetic element, is the best that Lacoue-Labarre could give us in critiquing Schmidt's idea of the political as representation of representation. If we want to make one step further beyond that, then Rabinovich's example of refutation can be useful. Let me then ask, what about Gestalt? What does the above analysis of the Talmudic form of refutation and of refutation mean in terms of the current moment in the increasingly complex relationships between humans, Jews, and other gestalts? Having to do with the relationship between Gestell and representation, this question more fundamentally concerns the Gestell. To highlight one outcome of the comparative exposition above is particularly important for addressing the question of Gestell in its modern form, that is, in the form of Gestalt. The notion of representation does no longer suffice to grasp the scope of the political form of the Talmud. Instead, that form has, or of Rabinovich, instead that form has to do with refutation as a way of memory, in which, because of multiplicity of its truth, there is no longer an orientation to privilege and being, eternal as it is for Plato, or temporized as for Heidegger, over its mirrors of non-being, and over its real other, which is that which only seems to be. So instead of the ontology of what is versus what is not, and more importantly, what versus what seems to be, the Talmudic political form would privilege refuting as the main world-shaping operation. What that means, however, is that there is no in that world there is no longer a privileged place for a refuter. There is no necessity to create an ontological type of either human being or a Jew or both of them as responsible for the process of refutation. Instead, to use Lacoue-Labarre's and to some extent also Lyotard's ideas, one may suggest that amounts to a different reading of the political. Let me explain this point, elaborate this point a little bit more in terms of Lyotard's Heidegger and the Jews work, as well as his discours figure. The point for Lyotard and the diagnosis that he gives to the modern political form is that beyond any kind of ontic, any kind of representational elements, there is a pre-representational element which he glosses as affect, meaning that behind, using his words or his language, behind the about what, the who, and to the whom, there always is the most fundamental, the what, which comes before the representation, and that this affect, if you wish, this anger or this love or whatever this affect might be, underlies all orders of representation and thus underlies the political. So that for him, the affect is the bottom line of the political community. This is not the case with a community based on refutation of refutation, because that kind of political would require, demand, and insist on having a rational, albeit not necessarily philosophical, but rational argumentation in terms of rhetorical categories of forensic, about the past, deliberative, about the future, or theoretical, I'm just using Aristotelian terms, about the skills of the orator. But the skills of the orator, the theory, do no longer, in such reading of Aristotelian rhetoric, do no longer bring forth a man, a Jew, or even a character. Instead, it brings forth the power of refuting. So it is much more important to be able to refute than it is important to establish one's identity as doing so. Okay. That means, if we rethink this in terms of modern understanding of the memory, that means that recollection needs give way to remembering. Approaching that new or well-forgotten form of the political, which Talmudic form of refutation, and in particular refutation of refutation, exemplifies, would mean, as I have already indicated above and elaborated in greater detail elsewhere, a reconsideration of refutation as the fundamental figure of memory, as opposed to figures of recollection, because recollection presumes the type or gestalt of the recollector, the person, either individual or collective. In contrast, as a form of memory, refutation does not necessarily assume any kind of single or homogeneous agent or subject. In contrast to either individual or collective recollections, refuting, let alone counter-refuting, as a form of memory, can never entail a single subject or agent, again, either individual or collective, because refuting must involve the position that is being refuted, and thus there is at least two. In the case of the Talmudic practices, that position must be strong enough to deserve refutation. It must not be obviously wrong, and thus, even if being refuted, must have a power to endure. Therefore, refutation does not mean annihilation. Such an experience is therefore never a one agent, a one subject, or speaking in modern terms, one man, or one nation, or one Jew business. It is no longer a business of any version of homogeneity whatsoever, human or Jewish. In light of these provisional observations, I would like to come back to Rabinovich's story. It not only illustrates, but also exceeds the models of the political advanced in Schmidt and of the modern type of Gestalt advanced in La Kulaba. Even if taken as a double specter of a human being and Jew, Rabinovich does not necessarily represent, but necessarily refutes. He therefore exceeds the specters in which he would remain confined in the framework of fictioning reason in opposition to the mimesis which continues to reign in the political action which he performs. The figures of refuting that he performs refute the opposition of fictioning and mimesis, and of the type of the human and Jew, turning on instead the dimension of the political as open past, which extends beyond the domain of either being or time. Rabinovich's anecdote both defies Schmidt's understanding of the political and reinscribes it into a broader view of the political form as refutation of refutation. On the flip side of the same coin, The anecdote is also a counterexample to Lekula Bar analysis of the illusion of the mimesis from the fiction in essence of reason, from which stems the complex relationship between humans and Jews as mutually conditioning modern types. Rabinovich is therefore neither distinctly Jewish nor distinctly human. Instead, he is political, but only in one sense. He refutes. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Chaviva Pedaya, professor of history at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev. She's also, I believe, the director of the Elishar Center for the Study of Sephardic and Oriental Jewelries. She's a research fellow, a senior research fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. She's described accurately as scholar, philosopher, poet, and critic, interested in the psychology of religion and comparative mysticism and in aesthetics. By Chaviva Pedaya, we welcome you.
Thank you. Well, I'm not used to speak. Okay. The theoretical attainment of 20th century Jewish intellectuals posing new structures derives from the feeling of participation, together with some of their colleagues, some of the native or in the hegemonic culture, in the creating of a new universal subject. Assimilated Jews, those for whom Jewishness is no longer an active factor of identity, serve as a kind of residue which is no longer characterized as such. In other words, a basic rule, besides the Ipcha Mistabra rule, for understanding the contribution of the Jewish intellectual is this: critical, theoretical reflection comes from fascination with discussion of the universal subject. It is not at all connected to structures and identities related to Jewish-Christian discourse. On the contrary, it is completely uprooted from it. By its very nature, a high theoretical dimension is entailed in the very attempt to conceptualize and characterize the Jewishness of the intellectual's contribution to universal general discourse. This discourse is not a substantive discourse which seeks out the qualities of nation and race of a particular group, much as it may sound thus, but rather a discourse of migration. In my opinion, it is a discourse of migration of unique kind, of cultural migration and migration connected with the great crisis between religion and secularization. My initial argument is this: the contribution made by the former stranger, who is now close, is a contribution of transparency to a higher resolution of structures, because he is lacking in the quality of intentionality, of that intention which exists with the one who is feel at home is in his culture. The stranger to the language is aware, first of all, to the structure of the language. The native is born, the native so-called, is born into the structure of the language. He acts within it even before he learns it. Enterness into the symbolic order is always accompanied by a structural catastrophe. This basic and universal childhood experience repeats itself in a birth with a new identity. The philosophical migrant enters into the language of the general cultural identity. The structural catastrophe finds compensation in the creation and identification of structures and in locating structures, new, different, other. So the point is not the Jewish identity, but rather the memory of abandonment of the symbolic order. The Jewish intellectuals are first of all curious about the idea of structure because they incorporate a structural consciousness which has been destroyed, suppressed, or erased. One suppresses a symbolic order but engages in the creation of another abstract symbolic order. The very heart of the issue of religion and secularization is here in question. In many cases, migration from the Jewish symbolic order involves not only a departure from the discourse of Jewish identity, but also from that of Jewish Christian identity. This departure from this system of double identity, without which it is impossible to discuss Europe at all, was already signified by Spinoza. The departure from the double is typical to the intellectual Jew. Jewish Christian system of identity as a basis for erasing identity and constructing a new universal subject is characteristic of the majority of the Jewish intellectuals who construct new structures and disciplines, while those dealing with a system of identity, whether Jewish or Jewish Christian, create another system, continuation with the philosophical and theological discourse from Rosenzweig until Levinas. It's a different type. And I'm not dealing with this type in this lecture. Movement from one order to another may serve as the basis for the ability to sharply define the order with a capital O. What order? The order of the soul, Freud, the order of language, Jacobson, until Chomsky, the order of the savage, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the order of time, Bergson, Lévi-Strauss, Benjamin. Among each of these figures, one may also ask about the timing, about the specific timing of reaching the stage of retrautralization. In this moment, they usually come back from time to history and from the universal subject to the essence of Jewishness. According to Freud, it happened in 1939 in Moses and Modernism, Benjamin in 1940 on the concept of history. If I attempt to apply the theory of Gobard as used by Deleuze and Guattari, I did it already in my book, Space and Place, I will try to describe these four stages of the of migration. I think you can see it here. I cannot elaborate on it, but I will speak about the principle, and meanwhile you can see the process, for example, of Freud. In the territorial stage, the subject is born to the religious language or traditional language as a structure. The language exists even before the subject is aware of it. It is therefore justified to define it as a place and structure, and hence the language is a kind of territory, kind of mother tongue. In the stage of deterritorialization, wandering or moving away from the structure of language, this pertains a deep self-perception in which the old archaic order is erased, abandoned and neglected. This is the moment of the murder of the father. This is also the murder that the father tongue collapse into the semiotic level and become one with the mother tongue. In the third stage, this refers to the migration or wandering of the signifier in seeking an object. Lacan emphasized that the signifier acts upon the signified, and in extreme case, the signifier creates the signified. This kind of relationship between them, when revealed as an extended group impulse or even as an obsession, that is so to say, is the impulse to act upon the signified. The need to create anew could be also a symptom of post-traumatic impulse. It happened in a Breckensel tradition in its complete abandonment. So I think I don't have time to, I hope you saw it. The situation with Jung is different, of course, from Freud, because for Jung, the ritualization is the returning to this as a Christian identity, and this is one main character of the debate between him and Freud, and I will return to this later. And I think I don't have time to. This process could also happen inside the tradition, but inside the tradition, the characteristics are different. Okay. So, through his participation in the joint of abandonment of the Judeo-Christian identity, and through the sense in creating the new man, the new universal subject, through the pleasure of discovering the scientific truth, the intellectual Jew invents the objective symbolic order of a subject without. He invents the objective symbolic order of a subject without a heritage. And I deliberately avoided saying the seemingly objective or the seeming heritage. The new orders uncovered by the Hellene, who has abandoned a deep, well-structured and well-rooted symbolic order, that is to say, one who feels himself as one who has permanently abandoned, who has erased an unnecessary past, and a burdensome system of signifiers are always structures. Okay. So I will move now to speak about the relationship between Freud and Jung from this point of view. Freud needed to free himself from religion, for where he related to any mystical feelings or symbol, he would have needed to have brought Judaism. He needed to reject the entire system of signifier and signified and to remain with liberated signifiers alone. His liberation from the discourse of identity, or from the discourse of that which signifies identity, was only possible by means of science. Through the purifying power of science, the excitement of the opposition to, and in the end, the break with Jung was, as I shall argue, first and foremost because of the return of Christian discourse. The complete emptying out was an axiomatic condition for Freud, of Freud's ability to create a new system of signifier-signified, while Jung once again took the goat back into an already crowded family home. And once he restores or returns God as the big other signified, he also brought back the Christian subject. Freud allowed the liberated signifier to create a new signified, and in the final analysis to create a new stable system of signifier-signified, whereas Jung restored the basis signified again. Jacques-Alain Miller mentioned that Lacan says that the subject of the Freudian unconscious, the subject which is seemingly so different from the cogito, is the subject of science. This is the specific and discarded subject of Descartes. The symmetry between Descartes and Freud is relevant to our discussion. This symmetry relates to the establishment of new science, new thinking, following and emptying out. If the purpose of the depth imposed by Descartes is the emptying of the human soul, emptying of the world of representation, then in Freud, the function of the negation of religion, of God, of ritual, of tradition, is essential for the emptying out required for scientific examination of the human soul. So, the birth of the subject therein which Freud discussed as establishing psychoanalysis, would be impossible without these two actions. First, the emptying out, the absolute negation of the system of signifier and signified, and secondly, being the reliance of separated signifier upon a new network presented by science. Evolution, biology, geology, archaeology, all these propose forms of logic and language which constitute for Freud the framework among which relations of signifier and signified are extended between the contemplative consciousness and the object of research. If so, the mechanism of psychoanalytic investigation invented by Freud is one that must of necessity include the negation. The signifiers that have been expelled from the signified, which were expelled of their own will, wandering about with a deep need to become anchored again in a new object, in a new homeland. But this is also the case with the libido after a great loss. So now let us look again in Freud discussion about Moses, trying to detach it from the specific part which usually and generally is discussed, and look upon it from this traumatic point of view, the traumatic crisis of the tradition. While Freud trying to anchor it in civilization, and I will take it back to tradition. Religion is established by trauma. Freud's discussion and summary of this subject appears in his discussion of Moses. We must remember that which Freud asserts in relation to Judaism in his discussion of concept of neurosis. What is presented in his writings is the analogy between neurotic processes and religious occurrences. Moreover, in the case of Moses and monotheism, it is not religion as such which is under discussion, but Judaism. Okay, I think. Okay. 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 I will quote because I'm afraid about my time. The only really, as Freud is writing, that the only really satisfactory analogy to the remarkable process which we have recognized in the history of Jewish religion is to be found in a domain apparently remote from our problem. It is very complete, however, to identity. This analogy is met with a psychopathology in the genesis of human neurosis and in the etiological trauma. So Freud notes that there are certain attributes common to neurotic qualities which are of two types, which he calls positive and negative. The former involves efforts to restore the trauma to its original force, to experience it again and again. This is a practice of fixation on the trauma. And the other is the negation, not to remember and not to repeat on any aspect of common trauma. Just remember how Freud asked his wife never to do rituals, and she even had to swear upon it before their marriage. So, of course, Freud is the second type. After the description proposed by Freud of the life of the individual, he turns to a general description of the life of religion. Since it can no longer be doubted, he wrote, after the discovery of evolution that mankind had a prehistory, and since this history is unknown, that is to say, forgotten, such a conclusion has almost the significance of an axioma. If we should learn that the effective and forgotten trauma relate, here as well as there, to life in the human family. So, how I shall deliberately ignore that which is the main point of Freud's essay, that is the story of the murder of the primal father, the presentation of the neurotic relations between Judaism and Christianity as religions of father and son. And I also will ignore even the analogy between himself and Moses and between the founder of the new religion and the founder of the psychoanalytic system. Yes, it must be the stranger who brings the new message, the new tiding. It is the stranger who is aligned to the tradition of signifier and signified who is able to bring about the revolution. But I will ask, what is the meaning of revolution? The meaning of revolution to suggest different and new connections between signifier and signified, to shake up that which is signified. The stranger is the signifier, the immigrant who domesticated the signified in different ways. From this viewpoint, Freud's strangeness is not only the strangeness of the Jew to Europe, the strangeness of the Jew to German culture, but it is a deeper strangeness. It is a strangeness of the Jew to the Jew himself, and to himself and to his religion. It is not clear whether this strangeness or estrangement was one that Freud established with his own hands or whether he was born into it. But it makes more sense that he himself established it through a series of denials, a series of negations that brought about a situation in which the next study he proposed was a study of the archaic tradition, which he places upon human civilization, may also be imposed upon his own specific tradition, that is to say, the Jewish tradition. If so, what brings Freud to argue that the reaction to early traditions is not always justified from the personal viewpoint and may only be understood in a phylogenetic manner, as relating to the experience of earlier generations? Maybe I will find it. Okay. The archaic heritage that I'm quoting, mankind includes not only disposition, but also additional contents, memory traces of the experience of earlier generations. This is from Freud essays about Moses. So on the one hand, on the surface, it would appear that Freud seeks parallels and traces. He declared purpose being to bridge the gap between psychology of the individual and psychology of the masses. But it seems that he also looking for explanation to his own tradition only 3-4 generations and not in the beginning of civilization. But within the framework of this essay, Freud proposed far broader discussion of the issue of the archaic heritage. He also, some of his arguments, once removed from overall organizing context, are very close to discussion of trauma and its transmission between the generations as it's only developed nowadays. So he writes, there exists an inheritance of memory, traces of what our forefathers experienced, quite independently of direct communication and of the influence of education by example. When I speak of an old tradition still alive in a people, of the formation of a national character, it is such an inherited tradition. So if we take the variety of assumptions by whose means he attempts to say something about the general human experience and the beginning of civilization as a whole, comparing the archaic heritage of mankind to the instinct of animals, we feel that an attempt is made to define the archaic heritage as one which may be turned from human civilization to Jewish civilization, and back again. In this application thereof, and according to these rules, we may define the archaic heritage as the unidentified and the non-deconstructed remnant which creates the basis of identity. We have arrived here at the heart of the paradox, which is part of the archaic heritage, which is the basic identity, whose existence placed the minimum of consciousness, specifically as an unidentified power at the basis of the net, which had been emptied around him, at the basis of the tradition, which was murdered around him, but he enabled the creation of a new system. In the final analysis, therefore, according to Freud, and despite the fact that at first glance any sociologist would say that Christianity, unlike Judaism, is a religion based upon trauma, Freud's discussion of Judaism is in practice a discussion of trauma and of its transmission through the generations. Miller, in his lecture on Lacan, comments also that it is difficult to imagine how things were before the creation of the crisis in the signifiers, which completely changed the coordinates. Those self-same intellectuals of Jewish origins who do not engage in their Jewish identity will, according to Freud, fit into this category. If we wish, we may describe them in terms of the inert gases of Primo Levi. But they are indifferent even to themselves. Secularization is, in effect, a murder of the symbolic father. Murder of the father by the law is murder of the closed system of signifier signified by its total abandonment out of apathy, not out of agonies of identity. This emptying is necessary in order to establish new projects of thought. From this point of view, the dispute between Freud and Jung regarding the libido, which led to the break between them, is not only traumatic return to the pattern of father-son in the Jewish-Christian game played out between them, but from Freud's point of view, the return of God as signified is the return of noise on the channel of the system that corrupts the possibility of establishing a completely new channel, which is impossible without erasure. Here you can see, I think you saw it most of the time. This is the famous letter of Jung, maybe so. From 1934, and we can see this is the retroralization of the signified. How much time is there? Okay, so I did it I was very slow, so I just want you to look at Spinoza, one of the Spinoza dreams, because Spinoza is a great example for, I see him as ancestor of Freud. And you see the dream, and when I woke up early in the morning from a deep sleep, and the heavens were already brilliant, there stood before me the visions which I saw in my dream, as living before my eyes, as if the things were completely real. I saw before me the figure of a completely black and leprous Brazilian, whom I had never seen before. This image almost completely disappeared once I turned my eyes to a book or to some other object in order to distract my attention from it. But without noticing, there again appeared before me this image of a Negro with the same vitality, and very frequently, until very slowly, the impression of his head disappeared. So this of course, is the return of the suppressed, the return of the Jewish identity was suppressed, and it's very important to see the object relationship, how they trying to repair the fear from this double. And actually I wanted to lead it to the double of Otto Rank, but think I won't be able to do it now. So if I have more 2 minutes more, I'll try to say something about Claude Lévi-Strauss, because I think that Claude Lévi-Strauss is also part of this system. And if we would see I will take only the quotation from Lévi-Strauss from Tropical Sadness, or because the image of Spinoza was also that it was Brazilian that he saw, and also the Jew here served as a tropical, something that is tropical. And Lévi-Strauss, if you will see what he writes, he says, the ethnographer who does not completely shake off his humanity strives to know and to evaluate his neighbor from an elevated and remote viewpoint. Only thus he is able to strip him of the specific circumstances of one or another civilization. The conditions of his life and of his work uproot him from his group for lengthy periods of time. He adopts a kind of chronic detachment from the total brutality of the environmental changes to which he is exposed. He can never feel himself at home in any place. He will always be a truncated man from the psychological viewpoint. This is not only the image of the anthropologist according to Lévi-Strauss, it is the image of the wandering Jewish intellectual who stands on one foot. The one foot is the foot of the signifier, and who invents the second foot, which means the signified. They all belong to the type of creators of new words and new systems. In the terms of Lévi-Strauss, the type of the engineer. And this is what Clifford Geertz could never understand. I'm not talking now about the anthropology of Clifford Geertz, and I'm not trying to attack it, but this is what he didn't understand about Claude Lévi-Strauss. He spoke about the background of Claude Lévi-Strauss, that Claude Lévi-Strauss is actually dealing with Rousseau, but actually he was dealing with his double, with Jewish identity. Thank you.
Speaking at the end of this session is Professor Elliot Wolfson, the title of whose talk speaking at the end is Speaking of the End and the End of Speaking. Elliot is a professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research, whose many, many publications focus on the history and phenomenology of Jewish mysticism as refracted through the lenses of comparative religion and critical theory. It's an honor to welcome Elliot to the podium, speaking at the end.
So from the very title of my lecture, it should be clear that the topic I have chosen is fraught with risk and uncertainty. To speak of the end, one must venture to the limits of both language and temporality. Phenomenologically, we experience all sorts of endings. Indeed, we are constantly beleaguered with the menacing sense of the impermanence of all phenomena. But I trust most would concur that the ending par excellence, the end of endings, as it were, is death. We may not want to go so far as Heidegger and define the finitude of human existence as being toward death, the ultimate negativity that he labeled the possibility of impossibility. But it would be difficult to deny Blanchot's insight regarding dying as the never-ending ending, the impossibility of possibility, which constantly informs the path of our being as the, quote, presence in the depth of absence, the possibility that secures our greatest hope of being human to the extent that it reminds us that, quote, the future of a finished world is still there for us. Echoing the thought of Levinas, Blanchot insists that death is not the abrogation of time, but rather the perpetual deferment that is constitutive of the alterity, wherein the self continually dies the death of itself in being born as the time of the other. As Levinas put it, to be temporal is both to be for death and to still have time to be against death. On this score, death is an occurrence that is technically a non-occurrence. The terminus delimited as the limit always yet to be delimited, the limit beyond which there is no limit, and hence the limit of what cannot be delimited, the threshold of time which may be crossed only by not crossing. Articulating a similar point, albeit in a somewhat different terminological register, Marion has written that death is a phenomenon, quote, that can be phenomenalized only in its coming to pass. For outside of this passage, it cannot properly be. It appears then only to the extent that it comes to pass. If it didn't, it could never be. Death, we might say, epitomizes a more radical experience of time, as the erasure written from the abiding transience of the end, the future that is always still to come. Probing the matter from an even more paradoxical perspective, we may say that human timekeeping is such that death is the signpost that illumines the way to the end that is spoken only as unspoken. But how does one speak of what cannot be spoken? How does one discourse about death without traversing the coming of one's time, as in our saying, one's time has come? Death, the unexpected, albeit altogether anticipated end that comes unendingly, as the end that is to come intermittently, opens consciousness to the moment that escapes objectification and thematization, a moment that may be rendered poetically as the confrontation with the face, most fully visible when it can be seen no more. In this encounter, the effacement at the intersection of being and nothing, truth is disclosed in the concealment of its disclosure. The sign of the end, accordingly, would signify the end of the sign. Before proceeding in our exploration of the end time, I would like to make a preliminary remark about the term Jewish that will be inflected in the ensuing analysis. Following the path of others, some of whose voices have already been mentioned today, the demarcation Jewish in my thinking is indexical concomitantly of the particular and the universal. Indeed, the former is only meaningful in virtue of the latter, and not in the Hegelian sense of a dialectical resolution, whereby the universal is expressed comprehensively in the particular, a singular universal, but rather in terms of understanding the universal as being configured continually in light of the particular, the universal singularity. That is, a universal that is, to borrow the formulation of Nancy, always calibrated from the perspective of being with one another, circulating in the with and as the with of this singularly plural coexistence. Applying this criterion, we could say that Judaism is emblematic of a universality that must be sought in the incommensurability of its own singular cultural expression. And in this respect, the exemplarity that Judaism represents in its exclusivity is inclusively exceptional, rather than exceptionally inclusive. Now, turning back to our main theme. Let me start with the observation that any discussion regarding the ends of theory in an age inundated by extreme fragmentation and disjointedness needs to engage the problem of the viability of system. There are a host of thinkers to whom I could turn, but I will frame my reflections in light of a comment of Rosenzweig. In a letter to Rudolf Ehrenberg, dated 12 December 1917, he wrote that system does not denote an architectural structure, which is formed by assembling individual stones whose meaning is validated by the sense of the whole, but rather the striving on the part of the individual entities for relationship. The merit of a system is dependent, therefore, on the postulating of a unity incessantly in the making, a cohesiveness that displays order through chaos. Rosenzweig elucidates his view by noting that in the Hegelian system, each individual is anchored temporally in the whole, and thus every present is interrelated exclusively to two others, the one that immediately precedes it as past, and the one that immediately succeeds it as future. By contrast, in his notion of systematicity, The genuine novelty of each moment is not determined spatially by its occupying a median position sequentially between what came before and what comes after. To the extent that the moment is authentically novel, an event of presence that is always in excess of being present, it is experienced as the constant resumption of what is yet to be, the return of what has never been, the vertical intervention that opens the horizontal timeline to the spherical redundancy of eternity. As Deleuze famously cast Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal return, repetition consists in conceiving the same on the basis of the different. What is the same is the recurrence of difference. For Rosenzweig, this paradox implies that the renunciation of totality and the consequent turn to the individuality are not an unmitigated rejection of system, but a reorientation based on a notion of system according to which universality is reshaped continuously in light of the entanglement of the general and the web of particularity. Rosenzweig's systematicity, I would suggest, offers something of a corrective to the postmodern dismissal of essentialism, insofar as it entails a conception of integration and a mode of discursive coherence that provide the relatively stable framework through and in which the changing constellations evolve, dissolve, and revolve, without assuming that all tensions, inconsistencies, and contradictions are reconciled in a unified structure akin to the Hegelian ideal of sublation. Moving beyond Rosenzweig's own rhetoric and employing the strategies of a more recent semiotic theory enhanced by contemporary physics and mathematics, I would say that the complexity of any given system requires that each one of the interacting semantic signs is implicated in the production of the very system that produces it, a network of patterns that express a dynamic and ever-changing interconnectivity. These patterns, however, do not form a homogeneous and symmetrical whole devoid of ambiguity. The lack of homogeneity and symmetry calls into question the rigidity of positing a clearly demarcated beginning or end. For our purposes, I would concentrate on the latter, although I readily admit that the correlativity of the two precludes their separation. In contemplating the end, we enter into the thicket of eschatology, literally the discourse of thinking about the end. For there is no end that has commanded as much attention in Jewish theorizing as the eschaton. Here, too, it is prudent to begin with Rosenzweig. The first thing to note is that the messianic paradigm he embraced is to be contrasted with the fulfillment of history affirmed by Hegel. The teleological notion is upended by an eschatology that presumes the possibility of the future directively breaking into the present at any moment, an incursion that disrupts the timeline and undercuts the supposition that there is a progressive march towards some definitive and attainable goal. Messianic hope hinges on preparing for the onset of what takes place as the purely present future, that is, the future that is already present as the present that is always future, the tomorrow that is now because it is now tomorrow. Eternity is not a very long time, wrote Rosenzweig. It is a tomorrow that could as well be today. But the tomorrow that is today, the present or the now time, as Benjamin's poetic expression had it, which he described as being shot through with splinters of messianic time, is nevertheless still tomorrow. Writ large, we can say that the delay of the end's historical concretization is what secures the potency of its constant instantiation. The continual deferral of the moment, the not yet that is resolutely yet not at hand, is what eternalizes the temporal and temporalizes the eternal in a now that is perpetually not now, the momentary present in which the future is made present as the withdrawal of being present. It is a positive to recall that the hermeneutic at work in Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption reflects this eschatological conception. Opening with the words "from death" and closing with "into life," the author leads the reader on an excursion, the conclusion of which is a return to the beginning. The star thus reverses the temporal order, allowing for a backward movement from the future to the past. Rosenzweig puts into practice the hermeneutical principle he made explicit in the essay New Thinking, that in a philosophical book, quote, a sentence does not follow from its predecessor, but much more likely from its successor. Even more to the point, in a second passage from that essay, Rosenzweig accepts the recommendation of one of the critics of the Star that the potential reader would profit by reading the book backward and forward. The author has no objection, as the book indeed forms a circuitous itinerary rather than a linear trajectory. I would add that this circularity is not simply going back to where one has been, a mere repetition and recycling, but it is rather a reverting to where one has never been. The origin is corroborated by the end, but in such a way that both termini of the spectrum are open, the end and the beginning and the end. By anticipating the past and recollecting the future, we are attuned to a mode of time that deviates from the conventional sense of narrative linearity. It is worthwhile recalling Rosenzweig's comments in Understanding the Sick and the Healthy. An introduction to a book can never be conclusive, since its task is to introduce, and hence the end to which it points serves as final verification. The end validates the beginning. That the end validates the beginning does not mean that the beginning is repeated in the end. In going forward, one goes back, but never to where one has been. The beginning itself is reconfigured by the end as much as the end is previewed by the beginning. The implication of the paradox of this linear circularity or circular linearity underlying Rosenzweig's theological vision were drawn most overtly to my ear by Adorno, whose decidedly secular politics and aesthetics were rooted in what has been called the Jewish passion for the impossible, a fidelity to the ideal of redemption that assumes the form of its refusal. Or in the traditional idiom, the Messiah can be present only in the absence of being present. An analysis of Adorno's negative dialectics is clearly beyond the scope of this lecture. However, I will focus briefly on one crucial aspect of his thinking, which likely bears the influence of Kant's neo-Kantianism, the conjunction between the motif of messianic yearning and the prohibition against images. Just as the latter translates philosophically into the claim that any positive depiction of God succumbs to a conceptual idolatry, the absolutization of the finite and the consequent invocation of falsehood as truth, so the authentic redemptive gesture involves a turning away from redemption. The essence of the messianic ethos lies in the fact that the God of Judaism, in contrast to ancient mythological deities, confronts nature as nature's other, and hence there is always the chance that the status quo of the world order might be disrupted. But this very prospect is self-negating, the double negative, the negation negating the negated, since every undermining is subject to being undermined. The possibility of redemption is bound inescapably to the impossibility of its actualization. Politically speaking, there is a basic mistrust in envisioning any social change as a final resolution. There is, in the end, no way to speak of the end that would not conjure the end of speaking. In the Dialectics of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer attribute this eschatological quality of resisting the eschaton to the Jewish religion, which allows no word that would alleviate the despair of all that is mortal. Analogously, Benjamin Riley noted that there is need for pessimism all along the line. The ability to reach the end has been appropriated by various postmodern thinkers as an indicator of a limitless hope in an open-ended future, but the thinkers I have mentioned saw the matter differently, perceiving that the incapacity for closure also breeds pessimism and despair. Perhaps even more pertinent is Benjamin's comment in the Theological Political Fragment. Only the Messiah himself consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the Messianic. For this reason, nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything Messianic. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as a goal. From the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but the end. Building upon but extending beyond Cohn's asymptotic conception of progress towards an end that is endlessly approached but never fully achieved, and the consequent distinction he evokes between eschatology and messianism, Benjamin maintained that history is not progressing towards some goal. The messianic is the end that cannot be attained. In the same vein, Adorno's utopianism embraces a non-eschatological eschatology and a non-teleological teleology, rejecting any reconciliation in the geopolitical arena that might divert one from the ongoing critical enterprise, which brings to light the contradictions and fissures integral to conceptual thought. In the wake of Auschwitz, the only credible philosophical thinking is the cognitive utopia, the mandate to contemplate reality from the standpoint of a redemption that can never be realized, to cultivate a knowledge marked by a consummate negativity that delineates the mirror image of its opposite, that is, a philosophy whose possibility is predicated on its very impossibility. Philosophy, in other words, as Adorno writes, must strive by way of concept to transcend the concept. In a slightly different terminology, Scholem came to a similar conclusion when he noted that the messianic idea in Judaism is anti-existentialist, since it has compelled a life lived in deferment, in which nothing can be done definitively, nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. The consolation of Jewish messianism can never be actualized except as calamity, and thus its greatness is also its constitutional weakness. In the manner of the seventh beggar in Nachman of Bratslow's renowned tale, the beggar without feet, the consummate dancer who is the one beggar not to arrive at the wedding celebration to which all of the beggars have been invited, the Messiah is the one that comes by not coming, the one that is present by being absent. As Mark Elaine Waknin observed, the Messianic era is not the time when the Messiah is here. On the contrary, it is the time during which the Messiah is awaited. The Messiah is made for not coming, and yet he is awaited. The Messiah allows time to be continually deferred to generate time. The waiting for the end indicates the adjournment of time that occasions the very engendering of time. And here we are all reminded, I suppose, of the celebrated observance of Kafka. The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last. Now, what is the distinction between the last day and the very last day? Evidently, the last is not final enough. But the very last day is the day after the last, a day that cannot come forth in the ebb and flow of time any more or less than the very first day, the first that would have to come before the first. Coiled within the recesses of Jewish utopianism and the distinctive sense of atemporality implied thereby is a tragic optimism regarding the sense of the end. The assurance of a future, the tomorrow that can happen today, even in this very moment, may be construed as a source of unending enthusiasm, but it cannot be disentangled from the inevitability of its failure. The possibility of the future lies in its already having been the past that can never come to pass as anything but the present that is always passing in its own future. The hope chartered therein springs from the hopelessness that the hope can ever be realized. One might counter that it is equally plausible, indeed preferable, to demarcate what I have described as a place of illimitable resilience, the interminable interim of futurity, in a manner that accords with Derrida's achronic conception of the future as the coming, l'avenir, of the event of a novelty that must surprise, because at the moment when it comes about, there would be no statute, no status ready and waiting to reduce it to the same. One can discern in this description of the endless end a phenomenological recasting of the obligation imposed on the Jew to wait temporally for the redemption that cannot transpire in time. The waiting provokes the longing for the advent of the non-event, the present that Levinas depicts as the mastery of the existent over existing, an occurrence that can no longer be qualified as experience, a phenomenon that is, technically speaking, beyond phenomenology. This is not to say that Levinas entirely abandoned the teleological aspect of Jewish messianism. On the contrary, he alludes to it when he writes of the infinite triumph of time, without which goodness would be subjectivity and folly. That the infinite triumph of time is indeed a messianic reference is confirmed by another less cryptic statement. Messianic triumph is the pure triumph. It is secured against the revenge of all evil, whose return the infinite time does not prohibit. On the one hand, the messianic triumph, which demands an infinity of time to be instantiated, consists in the victory of good over evil. But on the other hand, not even infinite time can categorically prevent the reemergence of evil. Without the infinite triumph of time, there will be no objective standard of the good. However, even if one posits such a triumph, there is no guarantee that evil will be utterly conquered. I cannot delve into the minutiae of Levinas's messianic speculation, but let me just state that his rejection of the Messiah as a person who comes to put a miraculous end to violence in the world and the injustice and contradictions which destroy humanity lends support to the conjecture that his conception of diachrony is a philosophical appropriation of the traditional Jewish dogma. from a meticulous reading of several Talmudic passages deliberating about the nature of the Messiah in a chapter on difficult freedom, Levinas infers the following: Judaism does not therefore carry with it a doctrine of an end to history which dominates individual destiny. Salvation does not stand as an end to history or an act at its conclusion. It remains at every moment possible. That the messianic deliverance does not summon the cessation of historical time, an end, properly speaking, is exactly what makes its eventuality possible at every moment, but this necessitates an elemental transformation of the conventional standpoint. And I won't go into more detail, but there is obviously affinity here with Cohn's asymptotic notion as well. Okay, so just pressed for time. Let me just move forward. So for Levinas, then, as we've seen in previous thinkers, the issue isn't so much concretizing a telos, but in the waiting. And this connects to his conception of diachrony of time. So let me just read quickly one passage from him. Waiting for the Messiah is the actual duration of time, or waiting for God. But now waiting no longer testifies to an absence of Godot, who will never come. It testifies rather to the relation with something that cannot enter into the present because the present is too small for the infinite. So to wait for the Messiah is not to wait for something or someone, hence the attempt to distinguish his thinking from Beckett, although I'm not sure how successful that is. It is to wait for the sake of waiting, and hence it induces the patience that is the length of time, and a waiting without anything being awaited, without the intention of awaiting. In swallowing its own intention, patience attests to the inherent interruption of the temporal. Time is deferred, is transcended to the infinite, and the awaiting without something awaited, time itself, is turned onto responsibility for another. In the final analysis, Levinas's diachrony is a phenomenological translation of the chiastic paradox that has impacted Jewish messianism through the centuries. The future is already present. That is always future. The coming of the Messiah, therefore, is the impossible possible, that which is possible because it is impossible. The moment in time that is outside of time, the moment that cannot be measured temporally, no matter how refined our tools of analytic computation. And hence there is no way to think its occurrence but as the occurrence of what cannot occur, save in the non-occurrence of its occurrence. I had a final section on Bloch, but I'm not going to read it because we've run out of time. But let me just conclude that I think what I'm trying to articulate here can neither be marked as pessimism or optimism. And maybe in the end it's hopeless to imagine letting go of the inclination to hope. But then we would do better to think of hope in Levinasian terms as an awaiting without an awaited, an awaiting with no anticipation, an awaiting wherein we can no longer differentiate between present and future, since the future becomes present as the present that is the future that is not present. The hope as such can never be fulfilled, but it is precisely because this is so that the hope lingers on, and hence we continue to speak of the end in the hope that it does not succumb to the end of speaking.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.